let's get something clear before you strap on that imaginary six-shooter and ride into your fantasy frontier. You, with your filtered water, your flu shots, and your mild discomfort at the idea of skipping lunch, you wouldn't last a single day. And no, we're not being dramatic. You'd show up, blink twice, and either be vomiting, bleeding, screaming, or all three. So before you start writing your cowboy nickname on a notepad, let's walk through the many, many reasons why the West would chew you up, spit you out, and use your bones to patch a leaky roof. You'd drink the water and die. Let's start with the basics. You need water to live. That hasn't changed. But out west, in the 1800s, finding water wasn't the hard part. Finding water that wouldn't liquefy your organs? That was the real frontier challenge. Sure, creeks looked clear, but so does vodka. And we don't recommend chugging either, straight off a cattle trail. Every water source was downstream from something you don't want to think about. Latrines, rotting animal carcasses, cattle herds, bathing, peeing, dying. Entire towns dumped their waste into the nearest stream and called it a solution. Bathwater, blood, and, let's say, bodily runoff, all mingled freely in that shimmering death cocktail. Travelers on wagon trains, like those on the Oregon Trail, didn't have the luxury of choice. During dry stretches, they'd drink from anything wet enough to leave a stain. That included stagnant puddles trampled by oxen, ponds with mosquito swarms so thick they had their own zip code, or water scooped from buffalo wallows that doubled as bathhouses and toilets for every passing creature. And what did all that hydration get you? A backstage pass to a full-blown gastrointestinal apocalypse. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid didn't just thrive. They threw raucous, body-shutting-down dance parties in your digestive system. In fact, more pioneers died from waterborne illness than from Native American attacks, bandits, snake bites, and all-out gunfights combined. You'd eat something you shouldn't. Out west, hunger wasn't just common, it was a lifestyle. And food safety? That concept hadn't even been born yet. If you were expecting something fresh, clean, or identifiable, you clearly wandered into the wrong century. Meat? Only if someone had recently shot something and you trusted their gut instincts. And lack of refrigeration. Salt pork? The go-to protein source. A sweaty, pale brick of fat, drowned in salt water and shoved into barrels that were never cleaned. It was so salty you could die of dehydration trying to eat it. Mystery stew might contain rabbit, snake, beans, or last week's regrets. Flour? With added protein, meaning worms, beetles, or weevils that had moved in sometime in the last 6 months. And if you were poor, and most were, you didn't even get meat. Your daily menu looked more like beans. Beans. Slightly older beans. Black coffee. Hard biscuits that could break teeth. And bread that had evolved its own flavor profile thanks to mold and time. Now let's talk consequences. Food poisoning wasn't an accident. It was an inevitability. There were no refrigerators, no soap, no real utensils. Just smoke, guesswork, and a lot of very questionable decisions. People routinely ate spoiled meat and knew it was spoiled. They'd cut off the green parts and say things like, "It'll cook out." Spoiler, it didn't. Stomachs twisted, fevers spiked, hallucinations began. Some folks got better, some didn't. Most learned to just live with mild, chronic gastrointestinal trauma as a fact of life. You'd catch a disease. Just by showing up still breathing? Not for long. The Wild West was a walking, wheezing, oozing epidemic. The second you arrived in a town, or even got within coughing distance of another human, you were already infected with something. Smallpox? Check. Tuberculosis? Double check. Syphilis? Practically a handshake. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no clue. Children rarely made it past age 10. Adults died in their 30s. And not because life was short, it just ended early. Travelers brought plagues to towns. Towns brought plagues to travelers. Brothels were biological warfare. Saloons were petri dishes with whiskey. And hospitals, when they existed, were the kind of place you went to die slower. Tools, needles, saws, reused, never cleaned. Doctors often moved straight from one patient's amputation to the next childbirth, without even wiping off their hands. And if you were unlucky enough to catch something, and you were, it wasn't just the disease you had to fear. It was the cure: mercury pills, arsenic tonics, bleeding therapies, forced vomiting, all standard protocol. You might survive the flu, but not the treatment. Coughing wasn't covered. People just spat on the ground like it was a hobby, and often hit your boot in the process. So, yes. By the time you stepped off your wagon and breathed your first glorious lungful of frontier air, the damage was already done. You just didn't know it yet. Give it a few days, the cough will come. You'd get injured, and that's worse than death. Let's say you avoid the poison stew and plague water long enough to actually do something useful, like build a fence or ride a horse. Congratulations. Now you've unlocked the next frontier hazard: injury. Out west, you didn't need to get ambushed by bandits to end up dying in a ditch. Wagons tipped and crushed people all the time, under wheels, between axles, beneath barrels of beans. Horses were nervous wrecks. If they didn't throw you, they'd step on you. If they didn't step on you, they'd panic and drag you through a cactus patch, just for fun. Guns misfired. And then there were the splinters. Yes, splinters. Because in a world with no antiseptics or antibiotics, even the tiniest puncture wound could become a festering, pus-filled horror story that ended with someone sawing off your limb by lantern light, while your friends held you down and cried harder than you did. Injuries weren't rare. They were part of life. And without modern stitches, clean bandages, or painkillers that worked better than a stiff drink, most folks just hoped the bleeding stopped before the buzz wore off. Fall off your horse? You're crippled. Cut your hand on barbed wire? Say goodbye to the arm. Stub your toe in the wrong boots? You're limping for life. The doctor was a butcher with a hat, so you got hurt, or sick, or both. And now you're praying for a doctor. Big mistake. Because out here, doctor was just a guy with a mustache, a box of rusty tools, and a bottle of whiskey. Maybe he'd read half a medical textbook once. Maybe he was a failed barber. Maybe he just owned a bone saw and had the confidence of a god. Either way, you were screwed. Medical care in the Wild West was an unregulated horror show. Bloodletting was still in fashion. Mercury was a prescription. Laudanum was given out like candy. Have a headache? They'd bleed you. Have a fever? They'd bleed you more. Have a broken leg? They might cut it off just to be safe. Surgery? That was done on kitchen tables, with no anesthesia except for liquor and a few friends to hold you down. Infection? Not their problem. Clean hands? What for? And if you were a woman, good luck. Childbirth was the leading cause of death among frontier women. And midwife often just meant neighbor with towels. You'd freeze, boil, or burn to death. Now let's talk about the weather. You like nature, right? The wide open plains, the snow-capped mountains, the endless blue skies. Great. They all want you dead. Summers were brutal. The sun didn't shine. It attacked. Temperatures soared past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And shade was less a solution and more a cruel joke. You sweated through everything you owned. Your hat, your dignity, your ability to think straight. Dehydration was a lifestyle. Sunstroke was considered a mild inconvenience. Your only sunscreen? Dust. Then came winter. And winter didn't arrive with snowflakes and cocoa. It came with wind that could strip paint off a building and freeze the inside of your nose solid. Temperatures dropped so low your spit froze before it hit the ground. Your joints made noises that sounded like rifle fire. Starting a fire became a daily battle against the elements, and sometimes the fire lost. And don't even think your clothing would save you. Most folks wore what they had: wool, leather, and hope. Nothing was insulated, nothing was waterproof. If your socks got wet, you wore them wet. Until spring, or until your toes turned black and fell off during breakfast. Cabins were no better. Built fast and badly, they had more gaps than walls. The wind blew straight through the boards, carrying in snow, dust, and the occasional startled squirrel. Chimneys belched smoke indoors. Fires smoldered more than they burned. Blankets were thin, shared or stolen. People froze to death, sitting upright at the dinner table. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it caught fire. Prairie fires could stretch for miles. Sparked by lightning, careless campers or lanterns kicked over during bar fights. Entire homesteads reduced to ash in minutes. Towns burned regularly. Fire wasn't an emergency, it was a monthly event. You'd be robbed, or shot, or robbed and then shot. Let's see how you handle other people, because out west, being around humans wasn't just a social risk. It was a survival threat. Law enforcement was theoretical. Sure, some towns had a sheriff, maybe even a deputy, but guess what? They were outnumbered, outgunned, and usually too drunk to stand up straight. Justice depended less on the law and more on who shot first and whether anyone was left alive to disagree. Stagecoaches were robbed. Homesteads were raided. Saloons were brawling festivals where chairs, knives, and entire tables flew through the air. You could be gunned down for cheating at poker, for looking at someone wrong, or simply for existing with money. Everyone was armed: children, bartenders, grandmothers. Guns were tools, status symbols, and problem solvers, all rolled into one. And while many people owned them, very few knew how to use them responsibly. Accidental shootings were common, intentional ones, even more so. If you looked at someone the wrong way, you might get a warning. Look at them a second time, bang. And if you had anything worth stealing, money, horses, information, or just a decent pair of boots, someone, somewhere, was planning to take it. Hygiene was a myth, and you were the experiment forget bathrooms. There were no tiled washrooms, no scented soaps, no porcelain thrones. Out west, using the facilities meant finding a semi-private patch of dirt, preferably not already occupied by a snake, or someone else doing the exact same thing. Outhouses existed in some settlements, but they were crude, smelly, and structurally questionable at best. For most people on the move, cowboys, settlers, soldiers, it was a shovel and a prayer. Toilet paper? Not invented yet. You used leaves, twigs, corn cobs, whatever was still available and didn't bite back. You were also constantly battling creatures that wanted to crawl, bite, nest, or feed on you. Mosquitoes showed up in swarms. Ticks burrowed into your skin and stayed until you noticed, or died. Lice set up permanent colonies in your scalp, beard, and undergarments. And fleas. Fleas were as common as dust. You scratched. Everyone scratched. It was the only social activity that truly united the frontier. Washing yourself wasn't easy. Bathing meant hauling water by hand, heating it over a fire, and hoping no one used it before you. People bathed maybe once a week, more likely once a month. And soap, if you had it, was homemade, harsh, and smelled like boiled animal fat and regret. Clothes weren't washed often either. Most folks had one outfit, maybe two, and they wore them until the garments became more bacteria than fabric. And then there were the rodents. Mice and rats ran freely through cabins, wagons, and camps. They chewed through food sacks, gnawed on boots, and occasionally nibbled on you if you stayed still too long. They also carried diseases, which people just called the fever or the death. You'd sleep next to rats and wake up with fleas or a rattlesnake. Exhausted? You should be. It's bedtime, but don't get too comfortable. Your sleeping arrangements are about to betray you. Beds, when available, were stuffed with straw, sawdust, or dirty blankets. Mattresses were rarely cleaned. Bugs lived in them. So did lice, mites, and whatever else crawled in during the day and decided to stay. If you were indoors, rats scurried through the rafters, and sometimes across your face. If you were outside, which was most nights for cowboys, you laid down on the ground, with a saddle for a pillow, a blanket for a tent, and absolutely zero protection from the local wildlife. That includes rattlesnakes. These charming reptiles were cold-blooded killers, literally, and they loved the body heat of a sleeping human. Cowboys would sometimes wake up to find a rattler curled up beside them, enjoying the warmth. Move too fast, and you'd get bitten. Move too slow, and you'd still get bitten. There were no good outcomes. And if the snake didn't get you, the fleas would, or the lice, or the spiders, or the freezing wind that blew through every crack in the wall, or every hole in the blanket. Forget restful sleep. You'd spend the night scratching, twitching, shivering, or slowly dying of venom. And by morning, if you hadn't been eaten, infested, or frozen, then congratulations, you were officially ready to be miserable all over again. You'd be completely alone when it mattered. The Wild West wasn't just dangerous. It was empty, vast, endless. You could ride for days without seeing another human being. Just rocks, sky, and the occasional vulture giving you a judgmental look from above. Out there, you weren't off the grid. You were the grid. And if you broke something, your wagon, your leg, your will to live, there was nobody coming. There was just the wind. Imagine breaking your ankle 80 miles from the nearest outpost. There's no cell phone, no satellite tracker, no distress flare. Your horse bolts, the sun's going down, and you realize right then that not a single living soul on Earth knows where you are. Not even your own family. You could scream for hours. The only ones who might hear you? Coyotes. And they're not bringing help. People died alone in the wilderness constantly. Not dramatically, not heroically, just quietly. A wrong turn in a snowstorm, a bad fall off a ridge, bitten by something venomous, lost in the fog. Most were never found. And if you did make it to a town, that didn't mean safety. Frontier communities were stretched thin. If you collapsed in the street, you might get dragged out of the way so you didn't block traffic. Or robbed while unconscious, depending on the day. People were too tired, too poor, or too busy surviving to deal with your drama. Neighbors helped when they could. But sometimes, they couldn't. And sometimes, they simply didn't want to. Generosity was a luxury. Frontier life hardened people, not because they were cruel, but because they had nothing left to give. Still think you'd make it in the Wild West? Let's review. You drank death water. You ate poison stew. You caught 7 diseases before noon. You broke your leg and got it amputated by a guy named Doc, who smelled like beef jerky. You froze. You baked. You got set on fire. You pooped in a wasp nest. You spooned a rattlesnake. And then, you died alone in the middle of nowhere, while your mule wandered off with your last can of beans. The truth is, the Wild West wasn't won by rugged cowboys with perfect jawlines. It was barely survived by people too stubborn to die on day 1. And even they mostly didn't make it past day 2. It wasn't a land of opportunity. It was a daily fistfight with nature, hunger, infection, and your fellow man. And the only prize for surviving? Doing it all over again tomorrow. So next time you romanticize the frontier, maybe while watching a movie where everyone has clean boots and perfect teeth, remember, it wasn't courage that got people through it. It was desperation, bad decisions, and a disturbing tolerance for filth.